We all believe in Hashgacha Pratis, in divine providence. That means to say that this is God's world. And as we've been discussing for weeks, in the Sha'ar Yichud Ve'emunah, it's not enough to believe that God is the creator of the world. You have to believe that He's the master of the world, including the stuff in my life that I don't like so much. He's the master of that too. So I want to begin with an interesting Hashgacha Pratis. Today, the 12th of Tishrei, is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Avram the angel, the son of the holy Maggid. The founder of Hasidus, of course, was Heilige Baal Shem Tov, the holy Baal Shem Tov. He was obviously the universal, the unanimous, the undisputed leader of Hasidus, because it was, if you will, his invention. So you can't argue with him about what is his. When he passed away, he was succeeded by his disciple, whose name was Rabbi, the Maggid of Mezrich, and he, for the most part, was also the single undisputed leader of the Hasidic movement. When he passed away, Hasidus diversified by design. It was a deliberate and conscious choice made by his disciples to decentralize Hasidus. It had certain advantages because of, well, the Baal Shem Tov, the official date for the founding of Hasidus would be 1734. The Baal Shem Tov passed away in 1760. The Maggid of Mezrich passed away in 1772, 12 years later. However, even though when the Mezrich Maggid passed away, there was an official decision made to decentralize Hasidus, to a great degree there was still some kind of a unification, because the Maggid left a son who was an incredibly holy man. They called him an angel. Avram the angel. They called him an angel because he was really not very human. The man never ate, the man never slept, constantly punishing his body. And he didn't live very long. He survived his father by only 4 years, possibly less. He passed away in 1776. His father passed away in 1772. Kislev, he passed away in Tishrei Tavkuf Lamed Zayin, 1776. He was an incredibly holy man. As long as he was alive, many of the Hasidic greats, who would then become great Hasidic masters in their own rights, remained unified under his umbrella. Like the Alter Rebbe, for example, considered him his Rebbe, his master, and so forth. What's interesting about him was that he very, very heavily engaged in a practice that is called sigufim. Sigufim, for lack of words, means self-infliction. He punished his body. He brutalized his body. He fasted incessantly, and he did other things to his body to exhaust his body in ways that, for an ordinary person, would probably be simply a violation of Allah. You would not be allowed. He was an incredibly holy man, and from his perspective, this abuse, this exhausting of his material self was a means of refining himself, halifying himself, bringing himself closer to God, however you want to phrase it, but this is how he lived. I heard from Rabbi Reuben, who's a rabbi, a non-Lubavitch rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi that I know, that his daily ration, what he ate every day was the skin of a dove. A pigeon is an abad bird to start with, and he didn't even he ate the skin, which is how this man kept his soul and his body together is a mystery. An incredibly spiritual, unbelievably holy man. And they called him a malach, an angel, because he was in fact an angel. What's interesting about it is that this practice of sigufim can be arguably inconsistent with one of the basic teachings of Hasidus, which is that you're supposed to be healthy, which I intend to leave to the end of tonight's class. I just want to mention that the tradition of sigufim, the tradition of punishing the body, it had an ancient tradition within the framework of Judaism. The Gemara talks about different kinds of Yisurim shal Yira, Yisurim shal Ahava, suffrage for penitence, suffrage for other means, and then there's a highest level of suffering which is called Yisurim shal Ahava, suffering just for the sake of love of God. Like the Gemara discusses the son of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, was Rabbi Shimon, that he had what was called Yisurim shal Ahava. Rabbi Avram the Malach practice. So what I want to share with you is this. In Jewish history, there was a very, very strong connection between this philosophy of suffrage, this philosophy of self-infliction, which begins with fasting, and Kabbalists, and the Mekubalim, going back about 1,000 years, 800 years, there was a group of Kabbalists, the earliest identified movement of Kabbalists, which perhaps even predate the official date of the finding of the Zohar. They were called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. They were called Hasidim in a very different way than we are called Hasidim, because they were actually Hasidim in the highest sense of the word. The classic rabbis were Rabbi Yehuda HaChosid, Rabbi Elazar Rekeach, Rabbi Avraham HaChosid, and others, Rabbi Yoino, who wrote the Hateshuva, and others. And these were people who absolutely beat up their bodies. How they lived, nobody knows. Rabbi Yehuda HaChosid was so into fasting that he fasted Shabbos. Now, halachically, you're not allowed to fast Shabbos, because Shabbos you're supposed to have pleasure. But for him, food was torture. This was Einik Shabbos. Eating for him would have been torturous. And there's a case when we're allowed to fast on Shabbos too. When you're fasting because of a bad dream, because it's considered redemptive, it makes you feel good. So not fasting on Shabbos is not to suffer on Shabbos. If not eating makes you feel better, then that becomes the way you celebrate the Shabbos. Gives you an idea what kind of people they were. And it's interesting that although Hasidus is obviously an evolution from Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic traditions, the Baal Shem Tov already fundamentally deviated from that tradition and said you got to be healthy. It's just one of those interesting Hashgacha Pratis in that tonight is the day of the Yahrzeit of Rabbi Avraham the Malach. The reason it's so relevant to us is because that's our topic, fasting. Now let's get to the Tanya, and at the end of the class I'll revisit and delve further into this discussion. Last week we started Iggeres Hateshuva, right? I forgot, I think we had 11 classes on Shariach V'Emunah, the philosophy. And last week we started the third section of the Tanya, which talks about the issue of Tshuva. And what I explained to you was that on the most elementary level, on the most basic level, Tshuva means returning to God. And on the most basic level, returning to God is about not sinning anymore. It's much less about correcting the past. It's even less than that about reversing the past. It's fundamentally about not sinning anymore. And as I explained it to you last week at length, there was a sense amongst people that tshuva is one of those mitzvahs that can only be performed by very special people, because it's a mitzvah that requires such intensity and just, it's a metamorphosis. You have to become a new person and you have to transform yourself. And of course, it would involve suffrage and fasting and all kinds of extreme things that would really leave most people outside the realm of the possibility of tshuva. And the Alter Rebbe specifically wrote the Iggeres Hateshuva as a reaction to this, to articulate that tshuva is, first of all, a practical mitzvah that we must perform, and second of all, it's a reasonable mitzvah that we can perform, because what we're doing in tshuva is inspiring ourselves for the future. First of all, the first thing about tshuva is kabbalah lahaba, that I won't do it anymore. The other aspects of tshuva, which are the regret and the confession, are what the Rebbe calls shleimus tshuva, to make the tshuva most comprehensive and whole. And of course, the other idea that we talked about last week is the concept of kapara, that the effect of doing tshuva is what's called in English atonement. If you don't know what atonement means, don't feel bad, neither does anybody else. And mutual ignorance is being informed. If everybody doesn't know, then we're all geniuses. In the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe interprets the word kaparas kinuach, wiping clean. We do tshuva. God is machaber. We return to God. God cleanses. That's the idea. Yom Kippur is a couple of days ago, yeah? We did tshuva. Hashem forgave us. And it's more than forgiveness. Forgiveness is I won't punish you. Kapara means you're not a sinner. And the past can be cleansed in part or completely from the future, from here into the future, perhaps even in a retroactive way, and so forth. So all of last week's class was about the viability, how realistic and down-to-earth tshuva is, and how we can do tshuva. And what we're doing in doing tshuva is telling ourselves, I won't do it anymore. Yom Kippur was Shabbos. Sunday morning I came to class, and I remember hearing this from my teachers, and I related this so much. I walked into my class and I said, okay, so how was Yom Kippur? And all the ladies started to tell me. And I said, I want you to know, I forgave myself. I said, before the night was over, I didn't even, a couple hours into Yom Kippur, I was forgiven by me. Which is, of course, not enough. And like I told you, it's not about forgiving ourselves. You start off feeling guilty, you feel bad about this, that, the other thing, especially if you have recent sins for which you need to atone, so you come at Yom Kippur feeling miserable, and a couple hours later, you did it, you said a little tillim, you shed a few tears, oh, you feel so good. Oh, I must be so pious. I cried. I'm terrific. God collected my tears. But it's much more than us forgiving ourselves. And it's even more than Hashem forgiving us. It's about returning to the Eibishter. That's what Yom Kippur is. After Yom Kippur, we should be better people in the subsequent days. It is an interesting halacha, which I think I mentioned to you, but in case I didn't, it says that the morning after Yom Kippur, you're supposed to go daven early. Get up early and daven. The simple idea is, you just did tshuva, your slate is clean, do a mitzvah as soon as possible. Don't waste time. But I like to tell people the idea that on a much more practical level, Yom Kippur is pretty exhausting. And frequently what happens by the time Yom Kippur is over, because you're so tired, the morning after becomes what we used to call in camp a lazy day. You sleep late and you're too tired and you slept to the minyan and you don't daven well. What happens if the morning after Yom Kippur is a lazy day? It's not just that you're not using that day. The effect of Yom Kippur is defeated before it has a chance to take any roots. When you have such an inspiration, you have to run with it. And you run with it the day after Yom Kippur, the morning after Yom Kippur. The Chazal say, the halacha says, make sure the morning after is constructive, because that's the translation, that's the implementing of the tshuva. Because tshuva is not, forgive me, my slate is clean, okay, I can start sinning again and collect a new collection till next Yom Kippur. Ich will mehr nicht sündigen. I don't want to sin anymore. That's what it's about. Returning to the Eibishter because I won't do it anymore. And that's what we talked about last week. So in summation, the message of last week's class is, tshuva is realistic, and above all else, it's positive. Now the question becomes, what about the presumed link between tshuva and suffrage? Everybody thinks part of tshuva, beat yourself up, punish yourself. Of course, the most basic form of punishment that we impose upon ourselves is psychological. Call yourself names, put yourself down, and make yourself feel like garbage. And of course, you know how psychology works. You feel terrible, and then you feel good about feeling bad. And then there's the rest of the story, which you can imagine yourself. There is an assumption that there's a link between tshuva and beating yourself up. So Rebbe, it's simply a mistake. It's not true. He begins the discussion, which is tonight's class, at the very end of chapter 1, with the simple statement that the idea that part of tshuva is making yourself suffer is wrong. There is such a concept. But the concept is, ufakadati b'shevet pisha b'regoyim aveinim. Sometimes Hashem brings suffrage onto a person. Now, the idea of Hashem bringing suffering onto a person as a form of tshuva is a very high level. In fact, it's such a high level that not only don't we want Hashem to bring suffering us as a form of tshuva, we find it objectionable. We have a hard time relating to that idea that somehow suffering, Hashem brings suffering onto me. We say, yippee-doo. Thank God I'm suffering because it's a sign that Hashem is atoning for my sins. And that's the truth. There's a concept of Yisurim that come from heaven. And the Rebbe says, it happens to those people who are the most righteous and the most pious, that, so to speak, the culmination of their efforts of tshuva is a cleansing that Hashem imposes on themselves that happens in the form of suffrage. But first of all, there's a fellow that I know who loves to say, I'm very happy I'm not a tzaddik. Hashem picks on the tzaddiks. This is his expression. And there's some truth to that. A little bit tongue-in-cheek. He says, I'm a regular guy, and me and Hashem have a great relationship, He doesn't make me suffer. I don't go over the edge. It's all good. Yeah. Greater people, the Gemara says, a higher person has a higher expectation and a higher standard. There is such a thing as Yisurim, suffrage, it comes onto a person as a part of tshuva. But it's a very high level. And I mentioned to you before that the Gemara says about Rabbi Shimon Yochai's son, that he experienced what's called Yisurim Shal Ahava, suffrage where he had no sins. Sometimes a person suffers. The Gemara brings up Rabbi Nakadosh, Rabbi, the one who wrote the Mishnah, he also had suffering. But there were certain reasons why he had done certain transgressions. Rabbi Shimon had no transgressions. This is even a higher level. So the good news is it's not happening to me or to you. Don't worry about it. Don't panic. But there is such a concept of Yiddishkeit where the elite, the highest madreges of Yidden, experience challenge as a part of their kapara, as a part of their cleansing and their refinement, and they come closer to Hashem. But there's a very basic criteria. You don't impose it upon yourself. Hashem imposes it on you. So the first point is that this presumption that there's a link between tshuva and suffrage and fasts is a misnomer. It's not true. Tshuva means returning to the Eibishter. Returning to the Eibishter means basically, I won't do it anymore, and convincing yourself that you won't do it anymore, not convincing the neighborhood. It's only one you have to convince is yourself. The idea of suffrage and tshuva, first of all, is something which Hashem imposes. Hashem, as Alter puts it, those who are zoiche, those who are meritorious, those very special souls who have done incredible tshuva, and if you will, are vessels for it, they experience a cleansing on this higher level. I've shared this on a number of occasions. I don't know if I've ever said this here, but I found this compelling to the point of almost disturbing. I personally heard from the Rebbe with my own ears. I wasn't the only person in the room, but the Rebbe said about his own father. This is a direct quote. My father merited to suffer physical pain. The Rebbe's father spent 5 years in exile. The Russians exiled him. And they really killed him. I mean, he died 5 months after he was released from exile, but he came home, a dying man. And the Rebbe said, my father was zoiche, tat zoiche given to leiden yisurim begashmis. And I remember I was a young adult at the time. I was 21 or 22 or 23 or 24. I was disturbed. How could a person say about his own father at zechev to leiden yisurim begashmis? And he came to a simple conclusion. I'm not the Rebbe, I'm the Rebbe's father. I'm a Joe. Literally, I'm a Joe. All right? I'm a nobody. There is a madrege, there is a level of person to whom these kinds of yisurim are a desirable thing. And the good news is, if you don't want it, they're not happening to you. So that becomes the second point. But then the plot thickens. The Rebbe goes into a lengthy discussion, discussing a variety of different reasons why people do fast. And they're really not necessarily connected to tshuva. They're certainly not connected to tshuva on a basic level. They're certainly not connected to tshuva on the baseline level, which means returning to God, as we discussed last week. Here's a few examples. For example, sometimes people fast to break a decree. Like in Purim's story, they fasted to take away the decree. There was an evil decree from on high, and people fasted. The fast, in part, was a tshuva also, like the Rambam writes, fasting is an from tshuva. But the fasting was also breaking an evil decree. When from heaven comes an evil decree, sometimes you replace the heavenly challenge by a self-imposed challenge. In other words, by fasting and making yourself suffering in a controlled way, the evil decree, which is a heavenly imposition of suffrage, is redeemed. So then you're not fasting for tshuva only. Now, even though every fast, the Rambam writes, every fast is an act of tshuva. You never fast just to suffer. That's not Jewish. Anytime you're fasting, it's a means of coming closer to Hashem. But the fast is not only as a means of coming closer to Hashem, the fast is removing an otherwise evil decree. Something bad is supposed to happen physically to us, so by imposing upon ourselves our own physical suffering, Hashem removes His. So it's not simply fasting for tshuva, it's fasting for an additional idea. Another point which he brings about fasts is that there is a concept of fasting to avoid Gehenna. Hell, purgatory, as it's called in the useless world of fancy English words that make some people feel good sometimes. A person lives and dies. There's only one thing we have to know. It's worth it. Whatever life is, and whatever we make of life, from a spiritual perspective, in other words, when you understand God's plan, it's worthwhile. You always win. You cannot lose. A neshama cannot lose by having been born. Problem is, it's a complicated journey. And one of the symptoms of that journey is, when we get home, in other words, when we return to the place where neshama came, we're pretty messed up. It's worthwhile. We've benefited. We've gained real, permanent things. But, life in the physical world, especially if we're not perfect, involves a considerable measure of imperfection. And we have to be cleansed. And that's what Gehenna is. There's all kinds of cleansing processes. We talked about it earlier in the series. The person has to go through in order to return to Gan Eden. It's worth it. But it hurts. In other words, when you put into a washing machine to get clean, after you get clean, you go into a wonderful place. But that doesn't make the washing machine, the rough and tumble, doesn't become fun just because it's going to get you to a good place. So there's a concept of fasting to diminish Oishe Gehenna. And again, the fast is not for tshuva. Because tshuva is not about Gehenna. Tshuva is about returning to God. Again, using the classic phrase, Ich will mehr nicht sündigen, I will not sin anymore. So if a person is fasting as a means of avoiding Yisur Gehenna, there is such a concept. But again, the direct link between fasting and tshuva is a misnomer. Another idea that he brings is that it's Mamay Gbar HaKapora. That means, and I suppose later in this class I'm going to be delving into this more comprehensively. Kapora is God's business, right? We return, God cleanses. Right? We have to come closer to the Eibishter, and the Eibishter atones, whatever atones mean. He washes us clean. There's a lot of levels in Kapora. There's a lot of levels in this concept called atonement, being cleansed. Sometimes fasts affect that the kapora should be more comprehensive, the atonement should be more comprehensive. And again, that means to say the fast is not about tshuva. It's about kapora. And one of the things that I tried to make a priority in last week's class is to make it clear that tshuva and kapora are not the same thing. Returning to God and being atoned for sins are not synonymous. They're not synonyms. They're two concepts. We do tshuva. Hashem is machapet. It's God's business. So a person wants to fast to, so to speak, help Hashem affect his kapara. That's an issue. But it's not tshuva. It's something different. So again, tshuva basically does not involve fasts. Another idea that he brings is that sometimes a person is not sure if his tshuva was enough. You're returning to Hashem, if you feel like your tshuva may be deficient, fasting, so to speak, adds a dimension of credibility. It has a cost. When things are expensive, you know that you mean it. So this is also not simply doing tshuva, but trying to affect that the tshuva should be more comprehensive and whole. So I've listed a bunch of points. I have 5 points. Number 1, that the suffrage is imposed by God. Number 2, to annul evil decrees. Number 3, to be spared from Gehenna. Number 4, to affect that the kapara should be more comprehensive. Number 5, if you fear that your tshuva is not wholesome. But in all 5 of the points that I just enumerated, tshuva is one thing, the fast is another. So the good news is, we can and must do tshuva. It's not a big deal. You have to mean it. And meaning it is a story, it's a problem, it's a process, it's a life. But what tshuva is about, tshuva is coming closer to the Eibishter. And coming closer to the Eibishter in the real world means we're not going to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And we can do it. Last week we had this whole conversation about how much of our sin is not motivated from a particular impetus or stimulus. It's just simply weakness, right? Prikasol, and we have to combat that, and so forth and so on. So this is let's call it the first point of tonight's class. that although there are many, many concepts of fasts brought in Sforim and Sifrei Musar and in Tanakh and in Gemara, in the context of tshuva, it is never tshuva, it's something else. Tshuva is simply returning to Hashem. The fasts serve various other purposes linked to tshuva, but tshuva remains simply returning to Hashem. And of course, the beautiful thing about tshuva is that when you return to Hashem, He invites you back in. He lets you in. You know, one of the most beautiful ideas that the Rebbe always talks about, the Chassidus are talking about tshuva, is it's an opportunity. Just think about the opportunity, you know. If you have a good friend who's very nice to you and you diss him, how many times can you get away with it before he tells you, you know what, I forgive you, just go away. Just don't be my friend anymore. Just, you know. The very fact that we have the opportunity to do tshuva, in other words, the idea that I can disappoint the Eibishter and disrespect the Eibishter and get another chance and another chance and another chance and another chance is an incredibly positive thing. The Rebbe says you should do it with joy when you think about, you know, who you are, what you've done, and what you're getting. And that's really at the heart of the Hasidic perspective on tshuva. The notion that we can fix a wrong and get a new start with Hashem is extraordinary. It's a wonderful advantage. But now we get into a whole new arena. There's another thing about fasts. And what I'm about to say complicates, it thickens the plot. Until now, I have argued, and of course, I'm sure everybody understands, I'm not arguing anything, I'm reciting what it says in the Tanya, that the fasts are separate from the tshuva. There's something else. Connected, directly, indirectly, but they're not the tshuva per se. But now we're going to learn something entirely new. This is chapters 2 and 3 in Iggeres Tshuva for those who are keeping score at home. In these chapters, we're going to be discussing a concept of fasts that is linked to tshuva. And let me put it in these words. There are two concepts of tshuva. There are many concepts of tshuva, but there are two concepts of tshuva. I suppose on a basic level they would be called lower tshuva and higher tshuva. In the Gemara they'd be called tshuva from fear and tshuva from love. There's different levels of tshuva from love. It gets quite involved, but basically there's two levels of tshuva. And there's a very, very simple illustration for this. A person has a relationship with a king. Relationships with kings are very special. They're a great opportunity, but there's a certain expectation. If you have a relationship with a king, you have to maintain that relationship. You have to honor the king, you have to honor the relationship, you're not allowed to take it for granted, and there's no such thing as a bad day. You know, you can't have a bad day with a king. What happens if you fall out of the king's favor? You did something stupid. You didn't do something that you should have done, and you lose the king's attention. Lose the king's attention, it's a slippery slope, you know. So you find yourself in a very uncomfortable position, very frightening, very, very unnerving, very unsettling space. You know, you're out of the king's grace. If you're out of the king's graces, it's not good, right? For various reasons. So you want to correct this compromise. So the first thing you want to do in correcting this compromise that's been created between yourself and the king is to take away his bad feelings. He's upset. The king is not happy. So you're going to say, I'm sorry. And you're going to say, I'm sorry in such a way that the king will say, I forgive you. But that's a half a story. Right? The king says, I forgive you. The next sentence says, I forgive you, but please don't come around anymore. You know, I forgive you, I'm not angry at you, I'm not going to punish you, but, you know, our relationship is over. There's another whole thing. And the other whole thing is you want to return to his graces. You want to return to his favor. You want to be his favorite disciple. You want to be his favorite subject. And this is an entirely different process. In the language of the Gemara, it's praklit and doiroin. Praklit means advocacy. And doiroin means, yes, gift. This is a very good word. An offering. Praklit, the English translation of praklit means an advocate, a lawyer. Paraklet means advocacy. You want somebody to speak on your behalf. You want someone to approach the king for you and to erase the negative feelings the king has towards you. After the advocacy has been effective, and the king says, I forgive, then begins a process of doing. You give the king an offering, a gift. You want to give, and you want to give something precious, something valuable, not only necessarily in money, something valuable to you, valuable to the king, something at great personal cost, not as a means of being forgiven, but as a means of return to the king's grace, return to the king's favor. This is a second step in tshuva. In other words, even though we spent so much time arguing that all the different fasts, reasons people fast, are not tshuva per se, they're related to tshuva, breaking decrees, completing the kapara, being spared Gehenna, and whatever else. But now we're introducing another concept of a fast. And now there's a concession being made. There is a concept of fasts which is in fact tshuva, but not the first dimension of tshuva, which would be the tshuva which we would call advocacy, the tshuva of being forgiven, but the tshuva of offering, of returning to the king's graces. You'll see in the later classes, which we're going to do after Yom Tov, Bli Neder, which is, I guess, a couple of Mondays around, Bli Neder. In Kabbalah and Hasidus, mysticism calls it the lower tshuva and the higher tshuva. But in Halacha and Nigle, in Chazal and in Shulchan Aruch, you have two concepts of tshuva as well. The lower tshuva is called advocacy, paraklit, to have the king, namely Hashem, forgive you. And the higher tshuva is called doiren, an offering, which is a means by which you return to the king's grace, return to the king's favor, as though you didn't sin. And there is a biblical and halachic simile for this. And that is, that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, people brought karbanos, people brought offerings. Karbanos served various purposes, and of course one of the purposes of karbanos was atonement for sin. What should be pointed out now, and perhaps I'll get to it in later classes, there was no atonement for deliberate sin. If a person did a sin on purpose, there's no offering for that. If you did an aveda with intent, even if it wasn't to spite, you just, temptation or anger, you do an aveda on purpose, there's no sin offering. Sin offerings are only for accidental sins. Now, the meaning of the word accidental in Jewish law is a little different than you and I understand it. To you and I, an accident means I walked into a room on Shabbos and flipped on a light. In halacha, that's not an accident. That's not unintentional. It's called oinus. It's not without intent at all. Shegig is a complicated category in halacha. It's not a legal class. An accident is not exactly an accident. It means without full awareness of what you're doing and the consequence of it. But if a person does an aved on purpose, a person does aved with deliberation, for the vast majority of avedis, there's no carbon at all. So what they did in the times of the temple, if you didn't aved on purpose, is an interesting question. We'll get to it later, maybe. But if you didn't aved without full intent, shogeg, which is not really a full accident, shogeg doesn't mean by accident, shogeg is not full deliberation and intent and awareness, but you bring an offering. It's called a sin offering, a chatas. And in some cases it's called an asham. Asham also means a sin offering. It's a different word, it means the same thing. There are different distinctions between the two. But the Gemara says that when a person sinned and brought a sin offering, he would also bring an additional second offering. And the second offering is called a carbon oila, which is really an offering which completely is consumed by the altar, by the mizbeach. The idea is, you sinned, you're saying, I'm sorry. The term that we're employing in denoting this, I'm sorry, is parakut, advocacy. Your lawyer, your spokesperson in saying to Hashem, please forgive me, is the initial offering, the sin offering. After you bring a sin offering, you bring an additional offering. The additional offering you don't have to bring. You volunteer it. There's no requirement to offer Hashem an offering in addition. You didn't have Aveda. B'shaygi. You bring a sin offering and that's enough. You volunteer a second offering. You're not commanded to do so. It's a choice. The significance of volunteering the second offering is because you don't want Hashem to forgive you. You want to return to His graces. And in order to return to Hashem's graces, you must do something extra, which you don't have to do. You're volunteering to do. It's a personal offering. And it's a personal offering means it's an offering of person. It's not just meat and potatoes you're giving the Eibishter. Whether it's meat, wine, and flour, and oil, you bring him a piece of yourself. And this second offering, precisely because it was not mandated, there's no requirement, there's no mitzvah to bring this offering, has a quality of return, which is not only called advocacy. I'm sorry, please forgive me, but I want to be a friend again. So the Alter Rebbe says, this is where fasts appear in the scheme of tshuva. In other words, even though we spent the first half of this class making the case very plainly, the idea that fasts and tshuva are synonymous is a misnomer. It's wrong. Tshuva is one thing, fasts are 5 other things. Now we're modifying that. And we're saying this. Basic tshuva, which is I'm sorry, does not involve fast. Advanced tshuva, comprehensive tshuva, higher tshuva, which is not just to be completely forgiven, but to return to the graces of God, as before one sinned. Here there is a concept of tshuva. We go back to the Gemara. In the Gemara already we find examples of rabbis who did incredibly minor infractions and brought upon themselves fasts to a degree that's it's indescribable. The Rabbi gives 3 examples. Rabbi ben Azariah was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was a great rabbi. And he and the rabbis of the Sanhedrin had a dispute. And as great a rabbi as he was in the minority. And the law is that when rabbis argue and the minority loses, the minority has to accept the majority's opinion. In other words, they're not allowed to do as they paskin. It's terrible aveda because we believe that Torah comes from God. And the rules of Torah come from God. Following the majority is the will of God. So if you don't follow the majority, you're not violating the majority, you're violating God's policy, which makes you a great transgressor. Rabbi ben Azariah once allowed somebody to follow his opinion against the rabbi. And the Gemara says, Hushcharu shinav mipnei hatzemis. He fasted till his teeth became black. That's a lot of fasts. For what? For what? He didn't even do anything. He permitted somebody to be lenient to a particular issue, which was according to his perspective, his point of view. It's wrong, but Vigil the Shir is Yiddish. How much are you going to fast? He fasted till his teeth became black. Mamish, so his teeth became black. Then the Rebbe brings 2 other examples. Rabbi Yeshua once made a comment which was a bit disrespectful. He said, I'm ashamed of you, Beis Shammai. Rabbi Yeshua was, I'm ashamed of you, Beis Shammai. And his teeth also became black from fasting. The Gemara, Rabbi Yeshua, brings about Rab Huna, who was a Ramayda from a little bit of a later rabbi. The tefillin have straps. His straps one time flipped upside down, and he fasted 40 days. 40 days for what? For nothing. This kind of extreme fasting is exactly that. It's extreme. The Alter Rebbe says, on the higher level of tshuva, the fasts are a part of tshuva. In other words, this is a whole new concept. Basically, there's no link between fasts and tshuva, as discussed in the first half of tonight's class. But on the advanced level of tshuva, where the tshuva is not simply to be forgiven, or even forgiven completely, but to return to the graces of God. Like before the sin, here there is a concept of fasts. And Alter Rebbe goes on to say something interesting. There is a book called Tikkunei Tshuva. If you don't have it, I advise you against it, because I own it.
You own it?
No, I own it, I said. Rabbi Pana wrote from Talmidei Arizal. And you read the Sefer Tikkunei Tshuva, and life gets difficult for you. In this Sefer Tikkunei Tshuva, the Arizal's disciples record lists of fasts for sins. You know, you do one sin, you fast 84 fasts. You do another sin, you fast 128 fasts. And 151, 73, only 61. I mean, it's just like mind-boggling.
Sliding scale?
Huh?
A sliding scale?
No, it's not a sliding scale. It's an absolute scale.
What? An absolute scale?
Yeah, and the volume, the number of fasts you have to fast for these transgressions, it's staggering. It's like, whoa! And of course, the short answer to this question is, this book wasn't written for the faint of heart. In other words, one of the things that's happened over the last couple of 100 years is Kabbalah has become popularized. Popularized, I don't only mean that people like to learn it, popular, but it's become the property of the masses. People who really have no business learning Kabbalah are learning Kabbalah. And listen, Hasidus makes no apologies for it. Hasidus is in part translation of Kabbalah to the person. But that doesn't make every Barberav the Chadyev, doesn't make every simple person a Kabbalist. So when you enter into the world of the Kabbalists and you enjoy it, and then you turn to the fasting page, you say, you know what, I think going back to basics, I didn't know this is part of the program. What we're missing is, Kabbalists are incredible people. They're not just incredible people because they study Kabbalah, they're incredible people because they're so pure. And they're so, free of sin, and are also, to some degree or in some way, with divine inspiration. They're close to God. If you're on that level and in that world, these fasts are actually reasonable. For two reasons. First of all, they don't sin. They don't sin in the first place. Second of all, when you're on this level and you're this sensitive, you appreciate how much effort needs to be put in to becoming resensitized when doing a minor infraction. In fact, one of the things, the Alter Rebbe gives 4 examples of fast at Tikkun Tshuva, and the constant in all of them is that they're not big sins. The first is anger. A person who gets angry, ready for this? Just 151 days fasting. That's it. That's all you got to do. You want to fix anger? Fast 151 days. What do you think? Huh? Prefer not to get angry, or what? Not to read the book.
Can you eat at night?
Well,
151 days, including night?
No, just
you can eat at night.
Just by day. Don't worry about it. You can eat at night. Yeah, just by day. Does it make life a lot easier for you? No. I want to interject a story. I want to tell you a story. Parenthesis. Beautiful story. There was a Jew who passed away only 15 years ago, 60. The Rebbe, the Heilige Rebbe. He lived in Muncie at the end of his life. He was very close to 100 when he passed away. He was a very, very holy man. You heard of the Rebbe. The Rebbe. He was in Seagate. It was way back. He was in Muncie at the end of his life. He was a very holy man. He really was a holy man. And he lived in Russia until the early 70s. And he was Meiser Nefesh in Russia. He was sacrificing his life in Russia for Yiddishkeit. He was very close to the Lubavitcher Hasidim. There were not many from Jews in Russia. And there were a lot of Lubavitcher Hasidim who knew him very, very, very well. To give you an idea who the Rebbe was, people came to shake his hand, to give shalom. By Polish, Hasidus is accustomed to shake the Rebbe's hand. If you were not in mikveh, he wouldn't shake your hand. But he didn't have to ask. What that means? Hundreds of men would file by. If you were not in mikveh that day, he wouldn't shake your hand. And he just knew. He just knew. It's mind-blowing. You watch a man who literally knows of you in the mikveh that day, and he may know some other things that you don't want him to know. Not going to the mikveh is not so terrible. There's other things. He was Aishal Kippur, a godly man. He used to break ice to go to the mikveh in the middle of the frigid winter. You understand? He was allowed to go to the mikveh all the time. The Mendel Futterfass, the Lubavitcher Chassid Unum from Chernovitz, said that he also went to the mikveh. He says, but he would jump into the ice and jump out. The Rebbe would sit in the mikveh like it was a spring morning. Oh, no problem. Ice water. He would just tell you what's going on. So here's the story. The Rebbe was a shoichet and a moil. Okay. In Russia, there was nobody else. A shoichet and a ritual slaughter and a moil. He did circumcision. And it was it was a Mesiras Nefesh. He was risking his life every day. But this is how he lived. He came back from the mikveh in the middle of the frozen winter. His shamash just cracked a hole in a solid block of ice at the top of a river so he can immerse himself in ice cold water. He walked into the house. His beard was full of icicles, you understand? He was frozen. And a Russian woman came into the house with a chicken he should shecht. She should shecht the chicken. So he said to the woman, I don't know what his issue was, but if you could wait a few minutes. He wanted to thaw out, maybe he wanted to do something else. He couldn't do it immediately. So the woman said, listen, Rabbi, if you don't kill the bird, I'll kill the bird. In other words, I'm not paying that higher price for religion. Be happy I even showed up, So he said, okay, give me the chicken. Took the chicken, he shechted the chicken. Then he turns to his shamash, his gabbai, we're going back to the mikveh. He says, Rebbe, it's 20 degrees below freezing. You just toiveled him. He says, I think, isn't this? Dachtzach, as the gewinna inye from Kaas. The tikkun for Kaas is mikveh. He says, I think I may have gotten a little bit angry. The correction for anger is to go to the mikveh. He went back to the mikveh and never hold in the ice and immersed himself somewhere. Now, can you relate to that? I can't relate to that. So I can't relate to 151 fasts for anger, I don't have enough days in my life to fast 151 times every time I got angry. Forget about it. You have to live forever. Maybe that's the good side of it. But see, that's the context. This incredible quantity of fasts is speaking to a person who's on a level, A, it doesn't happen, B, they're keli. They appreciate, it's when you're very, very, very refined, you appreciate how the smallest measure of the lack of that refinement, it's not a small problem, it's a huge problem. So he lists 151 fasts for anger, 73 fasts for drinking wine, which has a question about kashrus. It's not for short treif, stam yena. 61 fasts for being not particular about davening, and then 73 fasts for something else. Rabbi just gives 4 examples. Tikkun Shif is a whole sefer. It's a whole book. It's not very big, but it includes a lot of things, a lot of fasts for a lot of sins. Rabbi says this concept exists. But it's a different concept. This is not tshuva, returning to God. This is tshuva, returning to the grace of God, like as if you never sinned in the first place, which is a higher level. And in the world of Hasidus, this is called the higher tshuva, which, with the help of God, we'll get to in the second series of class on the Iggeres tshuva. We're going to go into the mystical dimensions of tshuva. And then the Rabbi goes on, and he says, now, let me ask you a question. If you get angry twice, you have to fast 302 fasts, or 151 will work for both angers. Got angry 50 times. Is it enough to fast 151 fasts? You have to fast 151 times 50, and so forth. This is the question. So he brings us a little bit of a Kabbalistic debate amongst the Kabbalists. What does it depend on? It depends on a very simple thing. If a person did 10 sins, he brings 10 chatois, 10 sin offerings. 10 paraklitim, 10 advocates, but one doirim, one offering. In other words, if you did a sin, so you do a sin offering, and then you bring a second offering to return to the graces of God, that second offering, which you're doing to return to the graces of God, can work for many sins. So the Kabbalists argue, you did one sin multiple times. You have to fast once, or you have to fast many times. If you did the sin 10 or 20 times, you have to fast 10 or 20 times 73, or 1 time 73 is enough. And the Kabbalists came up with a compromise. Just fast 3 times. So 3 times 151 is 453 if you're keeping score, yeah? For anger. Just think about that. That's more than a year. That's more than a year. Including Shabbos and Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, yeah? Why 3 times? Because the Zohar says that the nature of sin is compounded. In other words, when you sin once, it has a certain effect on you. If you sin twice, it has a greater effect on you. If you sin 3 times, it has an even greater effect on you. And the effect that sinning, especially sinning many times, the same sin, is that you stop caring. The Gemara says, "Avar v'shalom nas like heter." Sinning repeatedly, you lose your sensitivity to the guilt and to the sense of remorse and the sense of evil that's involved in that sin. 3 times is considered a threshold. You do the same Aveda 3 times over, you stop caring. And therefore, this becomes the Kabbalistic compromise. If you've done a sin many times, so some say you have to fast this number of fasts for each time you've committed that sin. Some say you have to fast only once this number of fasts for all the times you've committed that sin. And the Kabbalists came to the conclusion that you should fast 3 times the number of sins that would be required in order to return to the graces of God, which is called doiren, the offering which is beyond the advocacy. So, there you have it. So, says the Alter Rebbe, notwithstanding that I claimed in chapter 1 that there's no link between fasts and tshuva, and I explained that the fasts are something different, that's conventional tshuva. Tshuva, lashuv l'Hashem, to return to Hashem to such a degree that as if you never sinned and you're in His favor and so on and so forth, there is a concept of fast at this higher level. But then the Alter Rebbe says, where do we fit into this picture? What about us? We all supposed to start fasting. And I must interject here. Our Rebbe, the Rebbe, fasted constantly. Constantly. The Rebbe's wife used to say, the Rebbetzin used to comment about the fact that the guys used to imitate the Rebbe. Everything the Rebbe did, we try to imitate. It's a Chabad shtick. Every Hasidus has a shtick, we imitated the Rebbe. So the Rebbetzin said, instead of imitating, the socks that he wears and the suspenders that he wears, once you start imitating, he's not eating and he's not sleeping. The Rebbetzin was his wife. When she first married him, she was shocked to see how much he fasted. She actually wrote his father a letter protesting. She says, I married this guy, man doesn't eat. I tell him to eat and he refuses. So she wrote a letter to her father-in-law. And the Rebbe's father wrote him a letter telling him, your wife is complaining to aren't eating. And you know what he said? She had no right to tell you. It's none of her business. And the Rebbe his father writes back to him, you better believe it's good. She has every right to tell me. And I'm happy she told me. He writes to him, I don't think you've reached the strength of Samson. You're not as strong as Shimshon HaGibor. Anyway, guess what? I don't think he listened to his father either. The Rebbe fasted constantly. One of the great stories that they tell. And you're talking about Rebbe was in his early 30s, like 20s, a young man. It was one night after Maidav. And somebody was engaging the Rebbe in a conversation. And they were talking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour. And this person notices, the shul was already empty, and he notices that every once in a while, one of the members of the family would walk into the shul and take a look at them and walk out. The Rebbe's wife, then the sister-in-law, and then the brother-in-law, and then the mother-in-law, the Rebbetzin, the Alter Rebbetzin walked in. And they stood and talked for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Finally, the Rebbe's mother-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe's wife, walked over to him in the presence of the other man and screamed at him, how long are you going to keep fasting? The sun had gone down, so it's time to eat, but he's in the middle of a conversation. God forbid someone should know he's fasting. So he behaved like everything, just to talk to him. He fasted constantly, incessant fasting. And the irony was, he wouldn't allow us to fast at all. Rebbe fasted nachanan. And even as a Rebbe, even once he was a Rebbe with all those responsibilities, the Rebbe they had all kinds of cheshbonos, fasting non-stop. But the Alter Rebbe comes to this point. So how do we fit into all of these fasts? And the Alter Rebbe says, you have to remember, you're not allowed to fast unless you're healthy. In other words, if a person fasts and gets sick, that's not allowed. Even in the times of the Gemara, where you read about these fasts that we talked about before, as well as the fasts which are Kabbalistically based in Sefer Tikkun Tshuva La'ariza, you have to be in incredible physical health in order to be able to fast. If you fast and it has an adverse effect on your health, it's a sin. So before you decide to undertake a regime of fasts, which by the way means not just not eating, but it means not drinking as well, you have to have that criteria to be healthy. There's a story with our Rebbe also, that he was once fasting, and he came into a room full of people, to a meeting. It was a school, he was sitting with children, and someone offered him fruit, and he declined, refused. So the man said to him, you must be fasting. And the Rebbe became very emotional and said, you can tell. In other words, you can see on my face, on my countenance that I'm fasting. He says, no, I just realized not eating must be a fasting. You understand? But he fasted, in the years that he was in Berlin and in Paris, he fasted constantly. People who knew him said it was abnormal how much the man fasted. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Shabbat, once asked the Rebbe to go with him to a coffee house to sit and drink and talk. And he agreed. A while later he offered him again to go to, they were together in Berlin, the Rebbe refused. And he couldn't understand why. So we asked the Rebbe, did I ever upset you? Do you want to dissociate me? No, the Rebbe said, no, I don't want. And then he realized later, there was a bahab. The Rebbe was fasting according to some schedule. You fast b'chanant. But you have to be very, very healthy for that. So if a person fasts, and the fasts have an adverse effect on his health, it's a sin, not allowed to fast. This is especially true of a Ben Torah, a Talmid Chacham, a person who could otherwise study. Because if the fasts compromise you, and the result of that compromise, you're not able to study Torah, that's an additional sin. So, whether the fasts do have a quality of tshuva or not, in other words, even if it's true that there is a purpose in these fasts, because it's like the second dimension of tshuva, of return to the graces of God, like before the sin, which is called an offering, which comes after the advocacy, it doesn't give you permission to do it. You can only do it if you have the fortification, the health, the strength, the physical fitness to be able to fast. Otherwise, you're not allowed. So what do you do then? What happens if you're this really righteous person? And tshuva shleima, if you is not enough, you want to have, to return to the graces of God like before you sinned, and you cannot fast because you're not well. So there's another solution. And the other solution is, as Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, V'chate'echa b'tzedakah pereik, charity. Giving tzedakah takes the place of fasts. And giving tzedakah in copious amounts, in generous amounts, tzedakah is a form of tshuva. It's a very strong form of tshuva, especially in these generations. So if you cannot fast, then the Alter Rebbe says, give tzedakah. And he actually gives you a dollar amount in the Russian currency. How much money you must give for each day of fasts. It's not that much, $3 or $4. In today's currency, maybe $5, $6 per day. So do that times 151, it gets pretty expensive, you understand? But it's not $1 million. It doesn't have to be a $200 meal in a restaurant. Whatever it costs to eat, keep your soul about together. It's a Polish, it's a Russian currency. How much? It's been converted to dollars. It's $3 or $4 or $5 a day. I don't know. 20 years ago, it was $3 a day. I don't know what it would be today for a per fast. So instead of fasting, you give tzedakah. If you have you owe Hashem so many hundreds of fasts, so you multiplied that amount of money times that. So there was a great Hasidic mashpia, a teacher of Hasidus, who used to say, half a jest, he says, what happens if you can't fast and you're broke? You can't fast because you're not healthy enough. You can't afford it because you're not rich enough. He says, it leaves you only one choice. Don't sin.
Don't do
it. Yeah, no, don't sin. But then the plot thickens. What the Rebbe says, he says, even though it's true that you shouldn't fast if you're not healthy enough, and in our times, as a rule, people are not healthy enough. Imagine fasting and being in full function. Not fasting and laying in bed. Fasting and just doing what you have to do. And therefore, even if we choose to undertake these fasts, we compensate, we replace the fast with tzedakah. So, to fast one time is appropriate. In other words, for each sin, you should fast one time that number, whatever it is, 73 or 61 or 151. He says, but stretch it over the course of your life. 10 fasts a year, the shortest days of the winter. You can also get up early in the morning and eat. And he says, the other 2 times that you would need to fast to conform to the requirement of the Achra Mukubel is just fast half days. This is an interesting idea. Fast till noon, which is really not that impossible, especially in the winter time. Fast half days. Fast till noon. 4 half days equals 2 whole days. And the rest of the Alter Rebbe you should make up for in giving tzedakah and charity. And now comes an idea which is mentioned in the Tanya 4 or 5 times. It's a very interesting and powerful idea. But I want to give a short preface. The Alter Rebbe was obsessed with tzedakah. I've told this to you many, many times. He personally saw the solution to every problem, material and spiritual, as charity. That's what he felt. In his own personal life, Alter Rebbe's wife was the daughter of the richest Jew in the entire state. Alter Rebbe's father was a man of means, and they lived in poverty their whole life. He was given a 5,000 ruble diary, which is like millions of dollars today. He gave it away to tzedakah. He wasn't just a preacher, he practiced what he preached. Alter Rebbe said in today's times that we're not physically strong enough and we're not so spiritually sensitive. Our connection to God and our healing, the deficiency of connection, is through tzedakah. And he made this a centerpiece of his own personal life, and he made this a centerpiece of how he taught us Hasidim to be Hasidim. In the Alter Rebbe's world, and Bechlal in the Hasidic world, the solution to everything is tzedakah. And he goes further. The halacha is, Jewish law says that one is not allowed to give away everything he has to tzedakah. It's awesome. To be very... More than a chaimish. You're not allowed to give everything you have away. Why? So you're this righteous guy or gal, you give away all your money to tzedakah, and then you become a charity. That's not the way it works. Right? The Rambam writes, you're not allowed to do that. Just like it says, Tehei Shabbat Chachel, or the Tzadach Labrius, you're not allowed to make yourself a very lavish Shabbos, which will require to depend on people. So Rambam writes also in Hilchos, I think in Hilchos Deis, that you're not allowed to be very righteous in your giving of charity and then become tzadach labrius, depending upon people. But the Talmud's, the halachas category for tzedakah is you're supposed to give a tenth. You're not allowed to give more than a fifth. You have to give 10%, you're not allowed to give more than 20%. Says the Alter Rebbe, but if you are giving tzedakah as tshuva, that rule does not apply. If a person is giving charity as an act of returning to God, there's no limit how much tzedakah you can give. Why? He says, tell me, what percentage of the GNP is designated to medical expenditure? I think it's 14%.
In the U.S.?
In the United States, yeah. So a person says, listen, I earn $100 a week. I can only pay my doctor $14. Why? That's the average. Doctor charges $25 a visit. I'm sorry, doctor, I only have 14. You're not going to see me for 14? I'm not going to see you. It doesn't work that way. If you're sick, you have to be cured. You'll give away your shirt to save your life. He says, just as for physical health, you give whatever you have. You don't say, well, I can only afford so much. You do whatever you have to save yourself. Spiritual healing is equal to physical healing. And the Alter Rebbe therefore says, when a person needs to give tzedakah as a form of tshuva, the limitations associated with giving tzedakah fall away. And he emphasizes very, very much the idea of giving tzedakah not just as the basic idea of tshuva, but giving tzedakah of what we're calling the more comprehensive, the more wholesome, the more complete idea of tshuva. And this completes the second part of tonight's class. If I may summarize, the first half an hour we discussed the idea that fasts are separate from basic tshuva. And the second half an hour we talked about the idea that there's a higher level of tshuva, which is called dayd, and an offering to return to the graces of God, where in fact fasts are a part of it, and as a practical matter for me and for you, this means giving tzedakah. But let me move on to a third idea. Like I told you in the beginning, this is a very precise hashgacha pratis that today is the yahrzeit of Ram the Malach, Ram the angel, that we're having this conversation. There is a debate in Jewish theology amongst Jewish scholars and, if you will, opinions about the relationship between looking after your physical body, keeping yourself healthy, as opposed to punishing and neglecting your physical body, and your relationship with God. And there are 2 points of view. And I'm going to give it to you the way I understand it. And of course, I don't know everything. There was a point of view that said, took for the gufa chol the nishmasa. The health of the body is a challenge to the soul. Took for the nishmasa chol the gufa. If the body is neglected, that means the soul comes ambraza. This position was held very, very strongly by a group of rabbis who lived around 800 years ago. They're famous, the Hasidei Ashkenaz. There was a handful of rabbis who were steeped in Kabbalah, steeped in mysticism, who fasted incessantly. They would roll in the snow. They would sit on the nests of meat-eating ants. They'd bite into their flesh. They punished their guf. An ordinary person would do that. You would say that, besides the fact that it's crazy, it's against the law. You're not allowed. But when you're this holy, there's, I guess, different rules. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid fasted 7 days a week. He fasted Shabbos. This was his Einik Shabbos. And there was this point of view that these mystics held, that these philosophers mystics held, that punishing and depressing the body's needs and interests makes the neshama shine forward in a more pure way. But there's another point. And the other point of view is held by the Rambam, by Maimonides, who was a philosopher, who writes very emphatically, Hayes Haguf, Bari Visholem Edarki Hashemim, Edarki Avedis Hashemim. The health of the body is part of serving God. And he explains it very simply. How can you study Torah if you're cold? How can you study Torah if you're hungry? How can you study Torah if you're afraid?
What?
Afraid. And the Rambam makes it very, very clear that it is imperative that you look after your health, that you keep a proper diet, that you do exercise. I mean, the Rambam. So you've got two opinions. And on the face of it, it seems that this is a classic dispute between philosophers and mystics. The mystics had the approach of if sigufim, punishing the body, suffrage, self-imposed suffrage. Fast is just the tip of the iceberg. And the great philosopher Rambam had another point of view. He said, no, the body's got to be healthy. And I think that for much of history, that could be borne out. In other words, if you look at what's happened since these great rabbis lived over 800 years ago, you probably can see that trend, that the mystics were more into fasting and sigufim and so forth, while the philosophers followed the Rambam more. The change is in Hasidus. Hasidus is undoubtedly a movement that has, to a considerable degree, Kabbalah at its anchor, at its heart, at its root. Yet the Baal Shem Tov deviated from this principle fundamentally. The Baal Shem Tov said what the Rambam said. In other words, in spite of the fact that he was a mystic, but he didn't follow mysticism's culture, hook, line, and sinker. He had his own opinion, his own shita, his own derech. And the Baal Shem Tov said, you have to be healthy. The most famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, one of the most famous teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, it's a paraphrase on a biblical passage in Parshas Mishpatim. And I'll read it and I'll tell it to you orally. Kisira chaboyer. You'll look into your own animalism, to your own body. Sainacha, and he'll see he's your enemy. He's your animalism, your tzahar is your enemy. Reivetz tachas masoy. Collapsing under its own load. In other words, the Yetzer Hara is making your Yiddishkeit very difficult. So you'll say, I'm not going to help my body. In fact, I will destroy my body. When the Yetzer Hara's got you where he wants, the answer is, punish the body, fast, impose sigufim, suffrage upon yourself, and so forth and so on. Says the pasuk, no, ozev tazev imay. Don't punish your enemy. Don't punish your body. Serve Hashem with it. Make him healthy and make him a partner in your Avodas Hashem. Raise him up. And this became a cornerstone of Avodas Hashem of Baruch HaChasidus. That although Chasidus is certainly a movement which involves mysticism, and the great Chasidim, which were in fact spiritual people, very bad mysticism, nevertheless, this tradition that a part of the mystical bent is fasts and suffrage was to a great degree eliminated by the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, there is one single solitary known extant document in the original handwriting of the Baal Shem Tov to exist in the world. There's one piece of paper known to be the original handwriting of the Baal Shem Tov, and it happens to be in the Rebbe's library, Chabad's library. And it's a letter to the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, which has been published in Shilchei Baal Shem Tov way back. One of the first great disciples of the Baal Shem Tov got a letter from his Rebbe where he tells him, stop fasting, stop punishing yourself, and more than anything else, get rid of the depression. Serve God with joy. And that's really the approach of Chassidus. You want to be close to God, be healthy and joyous. The key to divine inspiration, the key to experiencing closeness to God is joy. The suffrage, the punishing of the body, which was so much a part of the mystical tradition, Chassidus, which is a clear evolution from that tradition, has very basically deviated there's no question about it, has deviated from that approach. And it's not only because we're not as healthy as they were and because we're not as capable they were. It's a different philosophy. It's a philosophy that says your body is not your enemy. Because really, one of the differences between Kabbalah and Hasidus is that in Kabbalah there's a good and an evil. There's a good side and a bad side. Kedusha and Klippa. The body is Klippa. Hasidus says that inside evil there's also God. And part of the Hasidic theology is finding God even in evil itself. And therefore it stands to reason, theologically, that Hasidus say, God gave you a body. Why are you breaking it? It's a gift from God. In other words, there's a theological basis to this approach that says, Hashem gave you a body, take care of it like everything else. What about Avodas Hashem? Humility can take the place of suffrage and joy. Joy. The answer to this is, you have to serve Hashem with simcha. Joy is humbling, there's no question about it, or it's a symptom of humility, and it opens you up to have a relationship with the Eibishter. But in Hasidus, the business of punishing yourself was not a priority. And I must say that many a Chassid hasn't been 100% loyal to the Baal Shem Tov. Many Chassidim fasted, plenty, including the Baal Shem Tov himself, I'm sure. But the position is you're not allowed to fast. As I mentioned to you earlier, today happens to be the yahrzeit of Avram the Malach, who was a disciple of the Mezritcher Magid. He fasted incessantly. He punished his body. And his own father was begging him, stop it, you have to be healthy. On his deathbed, on Eretz Devai, right before the Holy Magid passed away, he told his son to stop fasting and lift after his body. And the quote that he employed was, a klein lechele in guf is a grois lechele in the neshama. A small wound in the body is a huge gash in the soul. If the body isn't healthy, the soul's going to away. And he didn't listen to his own father. He once said, I don't have to forsake the will of my Father in heaven for my father of the flesh. So his friend, the Alter Rebbe, the Rosh Tanya, cried, how could you call the Mezritcher Magid a father of flesh? He was a holy man. He was a very holy man. But this was about, he punished his body. He suffered. And there's a very compelling letter, to me a very compelling letter, published now, from the Alter Rebbe to Rav the Malach. I want you to understand the history. Baal Shem Tov was succeeded by the Magid, by the Holy Magid of Mezritch. When he passed away, a lot of the great disciples of the Mezritcher Magid made his son, Avram the Angel, their Rebbe, including the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is the author of the time, Rebbe Shnei Zalman. So there's a letter where the Alter Rebbe is writing to Rebbe Avram the Malach, his now Rebbe. And he says to him, I have a problem, he says. Before your father passed away, he gave me the responsibility to look after your health. I have to make sure you eat and sleep. But it's very hard for me, because you're my Rebbe, I can't tell you what to do. So instead of telling it you face to face, I'm writing it you in a letter, and I'm begging you, please, so that I can fill my mission. Listen to your father. Stop fasting. Take care of your health. And he never listened. And he was by no means not the only one. There were many others. And you wonder about it. And I have no question around the Malach, because he was a Malach. He wasn't a human being. I will tell you what I know from the Chabad tradition. The policy by Chabad was that if a chassid fasted, he needed express permission from the Rebbe. Period. Not from a mashpia, not from a local rabbi, not from the Rebbe himself. Chassidim would come to the Rebbe and say, am I allowed to fast? And if the Rebbe said yes, he was permitted. If the Rebbe said no, it wasn't permitted. And the Rabbeim had holy discretion. The Rebbe sees his divine inspiration and so forth. And there were some Chassidim who were given permission by the Rabbeim to fast. Others were not. And I know as a matter of fact that the Rabbeim would be very makbid, they'd be very unhappy to learn that a chassid had undertaken a fast or a series of fasts that were personal without first getting permission. Once you get permission, that means to say the fasts are within a certain framework, within a certain containment. But understand that there have been many Hasidim historically who've undertaken fast and other forms of suffrage. You have to somehow work that into the model of Hasidic philosophy, because the Hasidic philosophy is you can't serve God when you're ill. You can't be inspired with God when you're depressed. There's no quicker way to depression than being hungry and cold and tired. Everybody knows that. You know? There's a story about a guy who went over to the Rebbe one day and said, Rebbe, I can't be a chassid anymore. I just can't take it. It's so hard. It's so frustrating. I can't do this, and I can't do this, and I can't do this. And he complained to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe stops and says, tell me, did you have breakfast? He says, no. He says, why didn't you have breakfast? He says, there's no food left in the lunchroom. He says, go back and find some leftovers and eat. And you'll discover that you can do it. You know, the guy was hungry and starved, so when you're hungry and starved, the whole world is grey. So Yiddishkeit was grey, Hasidus was grey, everything was foggy. You eat a little food, all of a sudden, God becomes real again. And this is why, even though there is this notion within the framework of Yiddishkeit of suffrage and fasts, it's not for the ordinary, and certainly not in Hasidus. Now, in our generation specifically, I know as a matter of fact, that the Rebbe told one of the great mashpiyim of our time that you're not allowed to allow people to fast. Maybe you can contemplate the fasting part days, half days, but fasting is absolutely not allowed. In 1988, there was a very distinctive event. Bahab, 3 fasts that people fast after Pesach. The Rebbe spoke 3 times. And if I may use these words, officially outlawed fasting in Hasidus. No more.
Even Bahab?
Even Bahab, even Bahab, and even part days. It said, no more fasting. You want to fast? Give tzedakah. Toshmam Chaz. I remember it very distinctly because it was such a unusual thing. And I can assure you that Rebbe himself was in the middle of a fast when he was telling us there were not a lot of fast. So this is how all of this is resolved, or reaches a certain conclusion. And if I can summarize again, we must remember that Tshuva is not about fast and about suffrage. It's about returning to the Eibishter. And if you think about it, that itself is very, very exciting because it's a very positive thing to be able to return to the Eibishter. What about fasts? So first of all, the fasts are not part of the Tshuva. They're parts of other things. And even this higher level of Tshuva, which does involve fasts, you have to be fit. And it's not so simple. And of course, the easiest thing to do is not to sin. Otherwise, we mabit tzedakah, to give a lot of tzedakah. This is the approach. Okay, so we're going.
What do you do about intentional sins?
Now we're in Zman Habayis.
What?
Now, Tshuva. The showers are about Zman Habayis.
You couldn't bring a chatz, you couldn't bring no carbon.
But you can do Tshuva.
Tshuva you can do without the carbon.
Lo kol kach pashut. When I meant I'll get to it later.
What's the relation to carbon and Tshuva? No, when carbon you need to do vidu.
When I said later, I didn't mean later today. I meant in a later class. We're going to get to it in Mitzvah Hashem in the next prakim. Hey, it's in the plan. It's in the future.
I would hope so.
Okay.